Good morning. We're about ready to get started. I learned that a lady from Somerville that was a good friend of Emily's, Janice Huber, passed away. So be thinking about that family. Also, we need as many volunteers as we can get for Vacation Bible School. So if you're able to participate and help out, please let us know. Also, this is in addition. On Wednesday during the afternoon, some of us go out visiting. But also on Wednesday morning of this coming week, Amber and Stephanie, right, are planning to go door knocking Wednesday morning. So if you have some interest in that, see Amber and she can give you more details. Is there anything else? Okay, Rick, if you'd come open us in a word of prayer.
Bow with me, please. Father in heaven, we are so thankful for the beauty of this morning and so thankful, Father, for the health and the strength and desire that you've given each of us to come out here this morning and study your word and draw closer to you. Father, we are aware of those that are unable to be here and ask that you would be with them and help them to be able to come back at the next appointed time. We ask, Father, that you be with the Huber family as they suffer loss and comfort them. And Father, we just pray that you would open our hearts and our minds to your word today. Forgive us when we fall short, and Lord, forgive us in Christ's name, amen.
Okay, in Hebrews chapter 10, we started into this last week, but I wanted to go over a couple more things. Oh, and by the way, next week I won't be here. We're going to be up at Big Mike and Tammy's camp, and Scott's going to be covering for me, so I think he'll have something pretty good for you. So. Oh, I'm sorry. That's right. Never mind that then. Next week I'll tell you that again. Senility strikes every so often. Anyway, Hebrews chapter 10, verse 35. Cast not away, therefore, your boldness, which hath great recompense of reward. The Hebrew Christians were instructed to have boldness when facing some of the challenges they were up against. And I thought about what Steve brought forward last week, and I think there's a lot to that. It makes sense to me that when the Roman armies at that point it was General Titus, and later it would become emperor, but it was about a 2 or 3 year process before they finally conquered Jerusalem. And there was a big, strong national type pride that Israel had in mounting a defense against them. Josephus said that perhaps as many as 1 million Jews died in that conflict over that period of time. And it makes sense what Steve was saying, that the Hebrew Christians would be under pressure from their family and friends. Aren't you going to help defend the homeland and everything like that? And as part of that, there maybe would also be pressure to go back, the temptation to go back to parts of the old law. You know, they would sort of try to tie the two things together. And friends and family might say things like, well, don't you want to defend your country? And of course, they did want to do that part of it. But they were also being tempted then to go back into the Jewish worship system of the old law. And the fallacy of that argument is that they could defend the Jewish homeland if they chose to, but they wouldn't have to sacrifice their Christianity to do it. This is a sort of like Brandon likes to bring up history type information. It's interesting that at that time, the Christians in Israel, when the Roman armies were coming in, they remembered what Jesus said, or at least was reminded of it by, people that were teaching them, that about Jesus' warning in Matthew chapter 24, where Jesus was prophesying, at least for the first half of the chapter, actually more than the first half, about the fall of the Jewish state. And most of them actually left the area. The Christians left the area, according to Josephus, and were spared the trauma of the last days of Judaism. Now, if you turn to Matthew chapter 24, and I'm not going to read the whole thing, but you can see Jesus' prophecy about what was going to happen. And I think it was interesting, some of the things that were said, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, know that it's time to flee to the mountains, and they did. And it has to do with, remember, there were certain rules about Gentiles coming into the temple, and especially into the holy place and Holy of Holies. Well, those things occurred when they finally ransacked Jerusalem. And the Jewish Christians that had been converted, they saw some of the things that happened, and they knew to flee. Also, during that time, it talked about where the carcass is, the eagles will be gathered together. Now, I didn't know this, and I found it an interesting thing about history. The carcass, if you think about it, was the old Jewish system, right? It was ready to die. It was dead. And what actually had already died, because the new law was now in place. So it was thought of, Jesus called it a carcass. And where the carcass is, the eagles will be gathered together. I wasn't aware of this, but the eagles, evidently the Roman army, and when they carried it was sort of like in modern warfare, sometimes in the 1800s, they would carry their flags into battle. The Roman legions would carry staffs with eagles on top when they went into battle. And I didn't know that. And therefore, where the eagles gather, where the carcass is, the eagles will gather. And so it was sort of a veiled, prophecy of who it was that was going to take down the Jewish state. And also it talks about when lightning cometh from the east and go to the west. It's actually what happened. Even though Rome is to the west of Jerusalem, and on the other side, really, if you like to think of it, the Mediterranean Sea, Titus didn't come that way. He came and went north and came around attacking Jerusalem from the east. So another sort of veiled prophecy that talked about how the Jewish state was going to be taken care of. So I thought that was interesting. But for us, when we look at that, sometimes people have to have boldness too when dealing with family and friends, because there's pressure. I read about, actually, where I learned about this was when I was at Freed Hardman more years ago, and I like to think about. when I was down there, I had Everett Hufford for one of my professors. And he told us this story. He actually had been over in the Middle East where there's a lot of Muslim type folks. And he had been active there trying to teach. And he told the story of a young man that converted to Christianity from being a Muslim. And his family basically disowned him. And he said people would try to make the argument and that, you know, why do you hate us type thing. And the young man says, I don't hate you. Why does the fact that I convert to Christianity automatically mean that I hate you? You know? But that's the way some people take it. You know, that it's a personal affront to them where really it isn't. It's just a person trying to do what's right. And sometimes the peer pressure of family and friends can't be dealt with very easily. I remember, and Steve and Pat would remember, back in the early days, when I was first a Christian, I tried to tiptoe around the fact that I was a Christian. I had some friends still in the world, and I didn't really let them know. It was sort of, they did in a way, but in a way they didn't. I didn't have this boldness that the Hebrew writer is talking about. Not at all. It was sort of like just casually mentioning it. And there's this temptation sometimes in certain social situations to hide your faith a little bit, not let it be out there and not be bold about it. And that's when boldness is called for. And I can tell you from my experiences, trying to hide your faith in social situations, it don't work anyway. It doesn't work anyway. I tried it, and it didn't work. You know, sooner or later you have to either go one way or another. And Jesus actually talked about that, didn't he? He says, you know, you cannot serve God and mammon. What he meant by that is you sort of got to make a choice. And it's easy for Christians, and I was there in the early days, and I believe I've worked with some people, the idea of 1 foot in the world, 1 foot in the church. It's a tough balancing act, and it really don't work. You know, sooner or later you have to make the call. Any thought or comment before we move on? Okay. Verse 36. And for ye have need of patience, that having done the will of God, ye may receive the promise. And then verse 37, for yet a very little while he that cometh shall come, and not tarry. So they're instructed to have patience during all this time of turmoil. And I think, again, back to what Steve was saying, this nationalistic pride, I think there are hints in these verses here. You know, be patient. You know, things are in the works that you don't see yet, but they're coming. And if tarry for a little while, and when Hebrews was written in the 60s AD, you know, the fall of Jerusalem came in AD 70. These verses might even be some hints toward that. I just don't know. But I've become now more convinced than ever that what you said was right. You know, yeah, go ahead, Steve. Jason's on his way.
Yeah. Okay. I have to wait on the microphone because nobody hears me if I don't have the microphone.
I understand.
But in the previous verse, you talked about boldness. It also, in other translations, it says confidence. You know, it's a little bit of both. You know, in English, you know, you're translating another language, but you know, you have to be a little bit bold, but it takes confidence. You know, both of those ideas are probably in the Greek. I don't know that for sure, but, you know.
It wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah. Here you talk about patience, it talks about endurance in this translation. You know, in our Christian walk, sometimes it could get long. And so patience.
Yes, it can.
Patience, endurance, you know, and patience kind of go together.
Very much so.
You know, sometimes patience doesn't carry the idea of being long as much as endurance does. But I think, you know, we as we live our Christian lives, we have to, it takes patience, but it also takes endurance, you know, and a little bit different concepts, but, you know, both of those ideas are worthwhile, I think, as we think about this verse.
Yeah, I really like that, the concept of endurance, because sometimes when we think of patience, we don't necessarily attach to it the idea of like maybe a little bit of suffering or a little bit of discomfort that comes with the idea of endurance. You know, because sometimes, you know, you have to like push through and keep going even when you no longer want to. I haven't been doing that for a number of years, but I can remember back when I was running some in my 40s and early 50s, and you know, it would start to hurt after a while, and you had to push through it. And sometimes I think in our spiritual Christian walk, you're going to come up to a point where you're feeling the pressure of it. You know, you're feeling discomfort, you're feeling frustration and stuff like that. And that's when endurance is called for, you know. And sometimes, especially when you think about, you know, health issues, like good night, that can frustrate people to no end, you know, because you're waiting to get fixed, and sometimes the healthcare system can sometimes seemingly take forever, you know, and it can be hard. You know, in verse 37, it says, "For yet a very little while," but sometimes the very little while seems a lot longer to us. You know, I'm reminded of the verse that talks, "For a day is as 1,000 years with the Lord," or something like that. It's probably not exactly a direct quote. And sometimes it sure seems like that, you know, because for us, we want things fixed sooner than sometimes it actually happens. Any thought or comment? Okay, verse 38. "But my righteous one shall live by faith. And if he shrink back, my soul hath no pleasure in him. But we are not of them that shrink back into perdition, but of them that have faith unto the saving of the soul." You know, the Christians have to live by faith. And sometimes, you know, especially when you're dealing with things of patience and endurance, your faith has to be strong enough to help you weather through all that. And, you know, if you think about it, it's been debated forever, this idea of when Christ will come, you know. And I think, it's been a while since I've heard it, but some people have calculated that it'll be at such and such a date and everything like that. And those dates have come and gone, and it wasn't, you know, God knows, that's it, you know. But even in the first century, Paul had to deal with that problem because some people at the church at Thessalonica got this idea that Christ was coming soon, and they just said, "Oh, okay." They quit their jobs and everything else, and Paul had to tell them, "Look, that's wrong what you're doing. You're just sitting around waiting for Christ to come. And remember, he said, if a man will not work, neither shall he eat. That was in that context. If they didn't want to get up off, I don't know what their version of couches were, but if they didn't want to get up and get after it, that was wrong. And he asked them to go back to work and do, what they should. The idea of faith, it's enough for us to know that God has promised things. And sometimes it takes a while for that to happen. But when he has promised something, it always does happen. Maybe not in our time frame that we're looking for, but it does happen. And so if we just are able to stay the course, and get through this life, then, we'll be able to enjoy the great pleasures of heaven. And it talks about, the great recompense of reward. And even Jesus himself, when he was dealing with all the agony of the cross, he looked forward to the glory that would be his. Sometimes we just got to look by faith to, what reward is awaiting us, and when that time comes, when we're finally in that reward, we can look back, and some of the things that we fretted about so much here will seem like, that wasn't really that bad. Not as bad as we made it out to be anyway. Okay, getting ready for chapter 11. Yes, Steve?
In verse 39 there, it is this idea of those who shrink back and are destroyed. The shrink back is the lack of endurance, the lack of patience that things are going to eventually be made right, and are destroyed. That even gets at the idea of once saved, always saved.
Oh, I like that.
That this, if you shrink back, and are destroyed, that goes against the whole idea of once saved, always saved.
Boy, does it ever. I've seen it in other places, but I never thought of it in this context. But, when you ask people like that, I had a Calvinist friend I worked with, of the once saved, always saved persuasion. And I says, well, what about people that leave your church? What about people that, were converted and then left? He says, well, they were never really converted in the first place. I took him to that verse, Paul says, ye who would be justified by the law, ye are fallen from grace. I says, how is it that if they were never converted in the first place, it says here fallen from grace? That means they were in grace, they were converted. I says, how can you fall from some place you've never been? They said they were never saved in the first place. Well, then how can you fall from that? And he didn't have an answer, But that's something that you can use verses like this to show that that way of thinking is not correct. Okay. Anything else? Okay, Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1. Now faith is assurance of things hoped for, a conviction of things not seen. Now it's interesting here that word translated assurance is the same Greek word that is translated as substance in Hebrews chapter 1 and verse 3, and confidence in Hebrews chapter 3 and verse 14. And like Steve talked about, sometimes the Greek words, in some ways the Greek language is more, it gives more information than sometimes the English language does. It was more complete in some ways. the things hoped for are all those blessings, both temporal and eternal, that make up the inheritance of the faithful. I would suggest that some of the blessings we have that we hope for are yet to be realized, but some of them we have already. You know, this is just speaking for myself, but I'll bet other people have been there. I sleep better at night now than I used to when I was younger, realizing that I'm trying to do what God has instructed me to do. You know, there was a time that I dealt with some anxiety issues because I knew that I wasn't really where I needed to be. You know, and I thought, oh man, if something goes south for me rather quickly, you know, I'm not in the place I need to be. And so some of the blessings you can have is just a confidence that we get from knowing that, you know, we are among those that are the saved. And like I say, I sleep easier at night because of it. You know, so that's some of the blessings we have here and now. And frankly, some of the finest friends you can ever have, you will have in the church. You know, I think of so many people that, you know, if I hadn't first came to the church, some of the friends that I've had with many years of, you know, interaction, that wouldn't have been. And what a shame that would be, you know. And so a lot of blessings. You know, some of the things that we don't see include all kinds of things in the area of faith. That goes back to the old idea of the creation of the universe, the incarnation of Christ, the judgment of the world by the flood, all kinds of things that we just have to accept by faith, you know. And I've had people ask me, they said, well, do you really believe some of those Bible stories? I said, I do. They says, doesn't it take a lot of faith to believe some of that? I said, yeah. I says, it takes a lot of faith to be an atheist too. I says, because you're holding to the point that all these things that you see out there just popped into being by something came from nothing. I said, that takes a lot of faith too. And I said, I don't care if you throw 100 million years into it, it don't change the fact that something don't come from nothing. You know, there had to be a split second in time where something did come from nothing. And you have to believe that if you're going to be an atheist. So it takes faith to be an atheist. There are some things we just don't know. And so every person alive has faith in something, you know, whether they realize it or not. They make fun of what they call our faith sometimes, but they have it too, just in a different way, for what it's worth. Either way you go, there's a lot of faith that's required in whatever viewpoint you take. Then in verse 2 it says, for therein the elders had borne witness to them. Therein means the faith that was just talked about. And the elders here talked about are all those great patriarchs and people of the old law and of the Hebrew scriptures that the Hebrew Christians would be familiar with. And the witness that they bore was to, you know, faith and believing and some of the things that they did in their lives, you know. Some of the things were tough, you know, but it worked out for them. And the Hebrew writer is going to talk about many of them now in the Hebrew chapter of faith, chapter 11. In verse 3 it says, by faith we understand that the worlds have been framed by the word of God, so that what is seen hath not been made out of things which appear. The great Greek, I don't know what you'd call him, philosopher, I guess, Aristotle, he said a lot of very smart things. And one of the things, and he wasn't a Christian or anything, but one of the things he said when it came to, he believed that matter was around forever. You know, they called the eternity of matter, and said that nothing can be made out of nothing. That's the way he put it, you know. And Steve would probably be able to help me here more with some of the things, but this idea that matter always existed, there's a law called the second law of thermodynamics or something like that, and it's this idea that things go from a state of good and it decays, goes bad. And I'll give you my example of it. You know, this is a sort of a low-level idea of it. When I first plant our garden in the spring, it's just so nice, you know, and no weeds, and we have it staked up and all this stuff, and the critters haven't figured out holes in the fence and all that stuff. As the summer goes on, what happens? You know, if you don't devote a lot of time to it, it goes south. But that's the idea, sort of the second law of thermodynamics, is that things tend to go from a state that's, well, let me give you an example. If the universe has always existed, as some claim, point one, and point two being, if the sun creates heat by converting hydrogen to helium, which it does, wouldn't it have burned out a long time ago? Because if the universe always existed, we would be in a point of total heat death. You know, where there would be no longer any heat left in the universe. And that, the second law of thermodynamics goes against that. Is that basically, okay, that's good.
That's basically it. Things go from a state of order to disorder.
Oh, that's what I wanted to say.
Things run down, and you know, even protons, which are probably the most stable form of matter, decay. So the universe, I mean, science has proved time and time again over the last 50 years at least that there was a beginning.
Oh, even atheists now think there was a
There's
beginning.
a beginning, you know, and so now the argument they try to make is, well, how did the beginning happen? And so they try to have natural ways for that to happen. But, I mean, even time had a beginning. And so in science, you know, the Big Bang, you know, time started at that point. You know, there was no time before that. And so, you know, these arguments about what happened before the beginning, you know, doesn't make any sense to begin with because there wasn't time before that. So
I've often wondered why they talk about this incredibly dense thing that exploded at the Big Bang. Well, where did that come from? You know, it's at some point you still have to have something come from nothing. You know, and it don't happen. You know, and I think we can see in Colossians chapter 1 and verse 16 what the real answer is. For in him were all things created in the heavens and upon the earth, things visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or principalities or powers. All things have been created through him and unto him. And also in Psalms chapter 32 and verse 6, by the word of Jehovah were the heavens made, and all the host of them by the breath of his mouth. For he spake and it was done, he commanded and it stood fast. That's in Psalms 32:9. So you know, your faith is based on things that make sense. And time again, as Steve said, you know, the more information we get, the more it proves that what the Bible has told us all along is true. For a lot of years, you know, there was questions about some of the biblical text, and then, I'm trying to think when it was. Was it the 1940s or something? They found the Isaiah scrolls, and they found out that it was almost exactly like the modern text when they compared it. You know, another proof. There's a lot of things if you look into it. I had a Christian evidences class when I was in college. It was great. Because if you really look at all the stuff, it really paints a picture that God is in control. Okay, any thought or comment before we go on? Oh yeah, Janice. Here comes Jason.
Yeah, I think it's really important to remember when you're talking to an atheist or a skeptic who really has a belief in science that a lot of what is being pushed today as science is actually philosophy. It's scientific philosophy. It's not, to be science, you have to have a hypothesis and then you have to perform repeated experiments to prove your hypothesis. Well, there's no experiment that you can do that can prove how the universe was created. Like you can't say if you believe the universe came out of nothing, you can't have a space with nothing in it because things already exist. So there's no way that you could just wait around for something to happen in this space with nothing because things already exist. And there's no way that you could prove that things evolved. You can buy DNA, you can buy all of the parts of a cell. Nobody actually expects that their jar of DNA sitting on the shelf is going to turn into a creature. It just doesn't happen. Even the people who claim to believe this stuff don't actually believe it. They don't practice, they don't act like they believe it.
Right. Janice brings up a good point. Science deals with things that you can measure and you can prove. There's a concept, and I'm trying to remember, is it called falsification in science? You have to be able to show, you know, and some of these theories, there's no way to show any, because you can't empirically test it to know that it works out, you know, so you're right. And I was just thinking, Clem, another thing that runs down, we talked about things going from a state of order to disorder. I went golfing the other day. Boy, when you put a couple years on you and you don't golf much, it goes to a state of disorder, trust me.
Was it ever in a state of order?
Oh, boy, I set myself up for that.
But it was more ordered.
It's in more disorder than it used to be. How's that? Yeah. It'll get there for you, too. Oh, that's funny. Okay, in verse 4 it says, "By faith Abel offered unto God a more excellent sacrifice than Cain, through which he had witness borne to him that he was righteous, God bearing witness in respect of his gifts, and through it, being dead, yet speaketh." As I was thinking about this, my mind works weird sometimes, but the Hebrew writer evidently had knowledge of the ancient text, you know, of the Hebrew Bible and everything. And he was back in Genesis and talking about Abel. And I asked myself the question, why wasn't, I mean, in the first couple chapters of the Bible, you read a lot about Adam and Eve. You don't read anything praiseworthy after that. You really don't. And it begs the question, I started wondering among myself, I wonder if maybe they didn't make it, so to speak, you know? Because it doesn't say much about them. It talks sometimes about through Adam, sin entered the world and stuff like that in the New Testament. But if you look for praiseworthy things about the first couple, you don't find it. And I thought that interesting. Their son, though, yeah. And for what that's worth, I mean, I'm not saying I know one way or another, but I just found that interesting that they were excluded from the Hebrews, chapter of faith for whatever reason. Now, Abraham, Noah, and others were mentioned. Now when we look at verse 4, sometimes people get all twisted up on this about why, Abel's sacrifice was accepted and Cain's was not. It was a more excellent sacrifice. And I have to believe that there had been some instructions given on how the worship was to be conducted, the sacrifice was to be made. And notice that Abel gave a sacrifice that included a blood sacrifice of animals. And Cain brought forth from the crops of the field. I think that even then, like what you see under the Mosaic law, that blood was required, in their sacrifices. This is my guess. I think they had been instructed that they were supposed to have blood as part of the sacrifice. If not, then I'm not understanding. That's why I think it was a more excellent sacrifice that Abel gave, because he brought of the firstlings of his flock. Any thought or comment? Do you think that's... But one thing we can find out is the difference between Cain and Abel is it does evidently matter how we worship God. And however the instructions were to them, one did it and one didn't. And so it matters for us. When we're instructed to worship in certain ways, it does matter that we do it that way. Because in cases where they didn't, you see the obvious displeasure of God included in that. Any thought or comment there? Okay, verse 5. By faith Enoch was translated that he should not see death, and he was not found because God translated him. For he had witness borne to him that before his translation he had been well-pleasing to God. So evidently, Enoch didn't have to deal with dying. He was just came and translated, is the word that's used there. He was just taken up into heaven. And it's because he was well-pleasing to God. The question becomes, will others ever be translated? Well, evidently yes, because in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 52, it talks about those who are alive and remain when the coming of the Lord will be translated, and they won't taste of death. And also in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 and verse 17, teaches those types of things too. So, and of course that promise though is to those who are saved when the Lord comes. Okay, it looks like I'm out of time. We'll take up in verse 6 there next week.